Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. Um, Thank you very much for Act Alliance to make this very timely discussion possible. It's an important moment when we meet right now. So it's a situation where many of us, many organizations are facing heavy funding cuts. Many of us are navigating in a very complex world of multiple crises. But it's not only that, it's also that a lot of our basic values are challenged at the moment. So I'm very happy to have all of you here joining this discussion, this space that should be a space where we can share experiences, where we can listen to each other, where we also can inspire each other. Because my feeling is that in this time of uncertainty and crisis, a lot of opportunities arise also. So while we want to discuss the complexities that we're moving in, we also want to discuss the potential of ethical storytelling. It matters what stories we tell, how we tell them. That's important for fundraising, but not only. It's about relationship building. So I'm very happy to have this discussion today. What's going to happen in the next 75 minutes is we start with an opening remark by Moritz Lacroix from Act Alliance, followed by a panel discussion on the issues of fundraising and ethical storytelling. And then we will have an input by Tendai Marima, a photographer and storyteller and journalist based in Zimbabwe. And we want to have this as conversational as possible. There is a Q&A part where all of you can ask questions, and we will pick these questions up later on in the panel. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll pass the word to Moritz for an introduction to today's topic.
Thank you so much, Noah. Hello, everyone. And once again, thank you for joining us for this important conversation. I'm delighted to also welcome you to today's webinar, A Crisis of Compassion. As Noah has already pointed out, my name is Moritz, and I'm the Resource Mobilization and Grant Coordinator for the ACT Alliance Secretariat based in Nairobi. And as you're all aware, we're gathering at a time when many organizations are actually facing a perfect storm: growing needs of the most vulnerable, increasing complex and multi-layered crisis, and at the same time, shrinking resources. Significant funding cuts, such as those from USAID, have added immense pressure, and the signs of donor fatigue all around us are unmistakable. And it is in this environment that we're all being called to think more deeply, more creatively, and crucially, more ethically about how we engage with donors, and beyond that, also with the communities that we serve. The broader funding landscape, as Noah has already mentioned, is currently undergoing a profound shift. Bilateral donors who were once considered reliable pillars of support are scaling back their commitments, realigning priorities in response to often domestic political and economic pressures. The UK's aid budget, for example, remains significantly reduced, and countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden are signaling similar retrenchments. Most notably, of course, USAID, long a cornerstone of global development and humanitarian funding, has been effectively sidelined due to decisions by the current US administration, which has deprioritized international cooperation. And this shift has led to a major gap in the global funding ecosystem, creating a challenging and also unpredictable environment for NGOs seeking long-term and flexible support. These changes are forcing organizations, many of whom are already grappling with painful cuts to programming and staffing around the world, to fundamentally rethink their strategies. And in an increasingly competitive and donor-driven environment, NGOs must work even harder to demonstrate their relevance, adapt to shifting priorities, and build new types of partnerships. The search for sustainable and flexible funding is really no longer just a matter of institutional survival, but it is crucial. It is a critical and crucial effort to ensure that essential services and protections continue to reach the world's most vulnerable populations, who are disproportionately affected by crisis and whose needs are growing as resources shrink. Individual donors, historically a crucial pillar of support for many organizations, are similarly showing signs of fatigue. With global crisis overlapping, constant appeals for urgent funding, many individual supporters are feeling overwhelmed, disillusioned, or simply exhausted. The emotional burden of ongoing emergencies, coupled with economic uncertainty in many, if not all, world regions, has made sustained giving more difficult. And in this context, building long-term relationships that are grounded in trust, transparency, and meaningful engagement becomes more important than ever. Ethical storytelling, responsible communication, and respectful representation are not just good practices. They really are essential to retaining trust and rekindling compassion in a crowded and increasingly noisy fundraising space. Meanwhile, philanthropic foundations continue to be active, but they are also evolving in their approach. Many are pivoting towards high impact, data driven interventions and are showing greater interest in scalable solutions and systems change. And while this presents opportunities for innovation and longer term collaboration, it also does raise the bar for access, especially for smaller and community based organizations. So, foundations are increasingly favoring partners who can demonstrate strategic alignment, robust accountability, and the ability to measure and communicate impact effectively. And at the same time, smaller foundations, not unlike individuals, are under pressure from market instability, prompting some to reduce or shorten their grant commitments. The private sector has been equally emerging as a potential partner in development, particularly through corporate social responsibility initiatives, impact investing, and public-private partnerships. However, engaging with corporations often requires NGOs to step outside their traditional frameworks, which means adopting business-oriented language, navigating the reputational sensitivities and risks of private enterprises, and carefully managing tensions between their values and the broader impacts of corporate activities. And while there is genuine interest in social impact, corporate partnerships still tend to be time-bound, visibility-driven, and closely related to brand values. For NGOs, this means balancing new opportunities with the need for authenticity and long-term mission alignment, which can be difficult. In sum, NGOs are operating in a climate defined by shrinking traditional funding, rising expectations, and the imperative to diversify income sources. The challenges before us is not only financial, it is fundamentally ethical. How do we adapt while staying true to our own values? How do we fundraise in ways that are honest, inclusive, and deeply respectful of the communities that we serve? Ethical fundraising isn't just about avoiding harm or following the rules. It really is about actively fostering transparency, building trust, and cultivating genuine connections that last beyond just a single campaign. It's about storytelling that respects the dignity of the people we serve, about partnerships grounded in mutual respect, and about resisting the temptation to let urgency override integrity. So today, as we explore these challenges and opportunities with our panel, I encourage all of us to ask, how can we reframe our approaches to fundraising, not simply to overcome donor fatigue, but to reignite compassion in a way that is sustainable, just, and truly human-centered? Once again, we're grateful to have such an engaged community here today, and we really look forward to your reflections and insights. Thanks again for being here, and let's get started.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for this analysis, highlighting the difficulties that we are moving in, but also already sharing a lot of positive and creative energy with all of us. Before we start, I have one more remark. The whole talk is also accessible in Spanish. For all of you who prefer Spanish, you can just switch the channel. So very happy to introduce a very interesting panel today, consisting of John Ecken from ELCA, Christine Bregale, until Friday, part of FHI 360, Wesley Koski from AMREF, and Catherine Irwin from Christian Aid. So to start this off, I would like to start with a question for Christine. So from USAID cuts to the budgets of various countries, funding for NGO is being cut across the board. Some are more affected than others. I think your organization, for example, was quite heavily affected. This means on the one hand that fundraising maybe becomes even more important, while at the same time, a lot of resources are cut. So my question to you is, what impact does this have on the team of your organization, and what actual consequences does it have for your fundraising efforts?
Thank you, Noah.
Christine,
Hello,
very
everyone.
warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. As Noah said, I'm actually sadly one of the many hundreds of FHI 360 staff who have unfortunately been laid off as a result of funding cuts. So I am now an independent looking for my next great opportunity, but I'm really happy to be here. But the the cuts we saw in the US, for USAID cuts, actually FHI 360 had already seen this trend coming for a while, and in many ways this is an accelerated uh, uh, an accelerated action, if you will. And we'd already been positioning ourselves for some time to think about how do we engage better with a private sector, with foundations, with high net worth individuals. We're not a fundraising organization. We are traditionally responsive to proposals and from various institutional donors. So for us, at the heart of that, when we set this new strategy, and I was hired in part to lead a transformation of our communications function, to change how we told the stories, how we connected with audiences, to expand our audiences, and also how we use storytelling, impact storytelling, and impact thought leadership to forge those connections. Just at the heart of that, really, we launched a brand strategy. We rebranded the organization. It was based on research, and so it revealed a number of strengths of ours, included being human-centered and locally led. But the other thing that was very important for all of us to consider is what were the drivers of consideration and choice from private sector donors and partners, high net worth individuals. And for them, I would summarize it by saying what they were really looking for and continue to look for is collective action and collective impact. And for us as communicators, that really means leading with the impact of the work that we're doing. The statistics are important, but those stories is really what can convey that impact. Back to you, Noah.
Thank you, Christine. And I think this is also something that we will discuss in the discourse in the following half an hour of this panel. Kind of what are the stories that really are able to convey the impact that our organization, that your organization has. A question to you, John. I think Elka is in a different situation. Not as I said, not all organizations are directly affected by funding cuts. Indirectly, however, everyone is moving in these complex circumstances. So in a time of division, maybe targeted fundraising is particularly challenging. In this difficult period, how are you, John and Elka, navigating your very diverse pool of donors who all have varying perspectives? I imagine there also to be a challenge in communicating with your different donor audiences. Can you elaborate on this? We can't hear you at the moment. I think you're muted, maybe.
Can you hear me okay?
Now we can hear you.
I apologize. We use Teams internally, which tends to take over our microphones at inopportune times. So as you stated, work with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So we're a mainline denomination located in the United States. Programmatically, you may know us through ELCA World Hunger and Lutheran Disaster Response. So as you mentioned, as a church, we have not been directly impacted by funding cuts. Because we're not a recipient of federal grants, but we've been clear about the fact that while our funding has not been cut from this perspective, it does not mean that our work has not been impacted. because we do not do this work alone. And in the field, we're doing this work alongside of many partners and many of our companion churches. And so as a community, our ability to respond has been impacted. The flip side of this too means that nearly 100% of our support comes from voluntary giving from individuals and communities and congregations. And as you mentioned, we do work with a diverse funding base. So I lead a team that involves annual level giving, but also our mid and major donors. And while sometimes when we send out appeals, the only communication we get from an annual communication donor is whether they respond with a gift or not. Mid and major donors that we're often sitting with or talking to on the phone certainly are open about their perspectives on this issue. And we know that as a church, we have donors that come from a diverse range of political views on this. In fact, I would go as far as to say there are probably some who believe that the government should not have been funding this work in the first place, but also that they would say that that does not mean that they don't think this work should be happening, but it should be funded differently. We also know that many of our donors are simultaneously receiving requests for support from other organizations, some with a great deal of urgency and a deeper sense of crisis because of the lost funding. So we navigate this, having to come from a place of finding consistency and focusing on the consistency of our work and finding common ground with our donors. So, focusing on inviting generosity shared on the intended outcome of what that generosity will do, but not as a response to a political action that has happened, but focused on our call to serve and walk with our companions. And while there's an opportunity to be reactive and that temptation is always there, the choice that we try to focus on is inviting people into something proactively rather than generosity as a reactive response to something. We've also just tried to be clear about our work in this field, that it's not been impacted and that many of our partners have been impacted, but also saying that as a church, we need to stay strong in our commitments, that as other people's ability to walk with our companions has been impacted, it's more important now than ever that we're able to uphold our commitments. Again, we're nearly 100% reliant upon giving from individuals and congregations. So, we know that if we're not active in soliciting that support, there may be a future in which our work would be impacted too. So, a lot of deep reliance on trust that we've built with our donors over time, trust that our story is staying the same and focusing on that, inviting generosity proactively to continue this work.
I think that's a very, very key. Thank you very much, John. I think this is also a key element of what we're discussing today, that the trust that you mentioned, kind of the trust that has been built over decades, over a long period of time. And this trust, I feel, is also something that is kind of starting to shake on many ends. While everything is interwoven, where the activity of many of our organizations are somehow connected, I think trust is a very key element. And at the same time, we keep on hearing about donor fatigue more and more. So people are not only the organizations, but obviously everyone is overwhelmed with a crisis after crisis, with so many different things happening on this planet, kind of being overwhelmed with possible actions to take, and also being more and more kind of people perceiving themselves as being flooded by, for example, different appeals, and they don't really know where to start. And slowly there is kind of a notion of people losing trust in different kinds of organizations. So my question to you, Catherine, by the way, since we don't have the chat, we will send the bios of everyone speaking in this panel at a later point. So Catherine from Christian Aid, my question to you would be around exactly this donor fatigue. So how do you navigate, how do you deal with this notion of donor fatigue in your organization? Do you have specific strategies or measures to counter this donor fatigue? And I think linked to this question, is also kind of how are you engaging with existing supporters, but then also the big question at this very moment, how can Christian Aid, but in general, how can organizations also win new supporters and win the trust of more people to the work that we do?
Thanks, Noah. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And John, I think I kind of understood a lot of what you said, felt very familiar to me. Christian Aid, we're a British-based INGO working with partners globally. And most of our funding comes from individual supporters. So ours is about 70-30, but I heard there yours is 100%. And really this issue around being really mindful of just the sheer volume of news, the news cycle every day. I think there is definitely a sense of people feeling overwhelmed at the moment. And, I think we're all guilty of it as well, that kind of doom scrolling, the kind of everything we see, the kind of latest news cycle, it can all really, it can put people off. But my experience is that we have to get better at really stewarding our supporters. So these are people that are already supporting our organizations. So we need to be really clear on those supporter journeys. What are we doing to look after them? We need to make sure we've got a balance of communication. So it's not all about fundraising asks. We need to make sure that we are engaging them in different ways. And the only way you can do that is to have a really good understanding of your audience and who your target audience and the segmentation of your audience. So at Christian Aid, over recent years, we've done quite a lot of work to say, right, this specifically, these 7 million people are the individuals who have the potential to support Christian Aid. It's not that our communications won't reach beyond that, but we know from a marketing perspective, these are the individuals that are likely to want to support Christian Aid. And therefore, we need to kind of understand them better. And so one of the things that's really struck me from our audience research was really understanding that there are universal values between communities and our potential target audience. So what are the things that are universal to you, to individuals, whoever they are around the world? So, for example, that could be around people wanting to find opportunities for their families. So really looking at those kind of generational stories. So grandparents wanting the best for their children, or those kind of values around family and just that kind of hope for the future. So that's one of the things I think that we can talk about in our stories, is really zeroing in on the agency that people in our stories have. So that there is a risk in our storytelling that it's almost like there's the kind of the that this is something that we then go in and deliver for people. But in actual fact, we know that's not true. The people in communities have just amazing, powerful stories of how they're leading their own change. And I think that if you can make those connections, and maybe the kind of best way to kind of give an example of one particular story, which we told last Christmas, was about a refugee from Darfur who crossed the border into South Sudan. And she was a grandmother. She brought her family, and she had just the most really touching story. But one of the things that really connected with our audience was that as a result of the cash distribution program she received, she was able to kind of set up a small stall. She has a real kind of entrepreneurial spirit to her, and those kind of connections that our audience was able to kind of make with that story is really important. So looking for those angles that kind of just really help our audience connect with individual stories is really important. And then perhaps there are surprising ways of telling stories, things that focus on the everyday. So, for example, we had a story from Gaza, which was a story of a young couple and their marriage plans, and just the kind of the story of a wedding, and bringing that to life in a way that just really shows that there is kind of hope in a really difficult circumstance, and shows that we are all the same wherever we are in the world. We all have the same kind of values and hopes for our children and our children's future. So tapping into some of that narrative has been really important for us at Christian Aid. So I'll leave it at that, Noah, and maybe we can come back to more discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I would actually like to ask a follow-up question to everyone. I think it's a very interesting kind of movement that shifts into like maybe community-based also, so communication, like really having the communities tell their own stories. And I just wonder, is that something just also giving the current fundraising landscape and the complexity of winning the trust of maybe new audiences? Do you think that this is kind of something new? Or why do these tendencies come up now, and why is it important now to kind of also invest in this kind of storytelling? Maybe you, Catherine, or maybe the others also have and inputs on this.
I'm a big fan of finding ways to really tell stories from the community's perspective and actually have them tell their own stories and shape the narrative. It's those stories become this. I think some of the best communications I've seen in my career have been when it's been told directly by communities themselves. We have an example of last year. It was a project funded by the Scottish Government in Ethiopia. So we could have commissioned a photographer to go in and capture some stories, but actually it was far better hearing those stories told by the community themselves. And so we had trained up a number to capture some photos to really show the impacts of climate change on their day-to-day life. And the photos were stunning. They were really beautiful photos, but the captions that accompanied them were brilliant. You know, they're just really personal. And yeah, I think they were really. And the other thing that was really interesting was then being able to share them with the donor, the Scottish Government, and then also with a kind of a broader network of people. And I just thought it was a really kind of powerful way of bringing the impact of an issue to life.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to jump into and say, I think, and what Catherine has highlighted is making the work that we do relatable to people all over the world, right? And I think that is the critical piece. And no matter where you live, it's sometimes hard to relate to the experience of someone in another country or on another continent. So that aspect of it. But I also want to throw in there's actually scientific research that shows that storytelling has a physiological impact on the brain. And so when people listen to compelling stories, the brain releases oxytocin. And that's often referred to as the bonding hormone, right? And so it leads to increased feelings of trust and empathy towards both the storyteller and the narrative and the organization that's sharing that narrative or publishing that narrative. And it also helps people remember your story and your data points with greater accuracy. So there's actually science behind this that builds the business case for that storytelling. And then our trick, right, as Catherine and John and FHI 360, all of us work with, is how do we use that storytelling to advance our business development, our fundraising, our public policy advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's also very interesting. And I think it's a time where more and more kind of empirical evidence pops up that different kinds of storytelling can work in fundraising. So this is also from our Fair Picture perspective. We often hear, especially from fundraising professionals, that only a certain kind of appeal would bring the necessary donor returns. And kind of, I think this is slowly starting to shift. Also, thanks to organizations such as AMREF, I think. So Wesley, I think AMREF has been at the forefront of ethical storytelling for years. AMREF has been very creative in exploring different approaches to storytelling and also creating reliable data, something that Fair Picture, for example, is also very thankful for, that there are now studies and kind of cases made for ethical storytelling. So my question to you, Wesley, is how can fundraising actively, also connecting to the discussion before, how can fundraising actively contribute to building trust and ensuring transparency? What kinds of stories do we need to tell to strengthen that trust? Very happy if you can share a bit of your experience with Amref. And before I let you go on that question, anyone who has questions to ask, please feel free to drop them in the chat, so we can pick them up later. Wesley.
Thanks very much, Noah, and thanks for that question. I think first it's just good to sometimes it's good to just go back and think about how we got here. When we think about the ethical dynamics of storytelling and where we are now, I think it sort of stems out from, I would say, sort of the colonial social design and economic design, and sort of later on the globalization and media always speaking about issues, and especially, of Africa, and the constructions of narratives by, global media and us, the NGOs. I think we also sort of, at the beginning, we also really were pushing and sort of characterizing, our continent around, in terms of, sort of hopelessness and that kind of thing. So all that came, and then at one point we kind of, it was like a cliffhanger, fell, and it became almost like a crisis at that point. And AMREF obviously being part of this group, I think we've also sort of may have participated in that of that. But then there's been a turnaround. There's been this movement about, how do we tell better stories to ensure that people are represented. AMREF South Africa is community centered. So, and also, it's African rooted. We work a lot of with a lot of communities. And over the years, we've been learning, like many organizations, about how do we ensure that we tell stories that reflect or, sort of give communities that voice. I think, first of all, at least from my perspective, is just realizing the power of our stories. There's this theory about the death of the author, that when you, as an author, do a story, and when the person who's reading it starts to read it, you've already given up the power for the person to interpret it the way they want to do it. And when that narrative is pushed, and when that people interpret it in similar ways, it creates this stereotype about those kinds of people. So from our perspective at AMREF, being in that journey, we have, so I guess, in the past, we had this interesting research, a small example called Who Owns the Story, which happened 2-3 years ago, working with some universities in London. And the interesting bit about it is that it was comparing a charity-led content creation versus sort of like contributor-led, so somebody in the local communities. And it was a bit of a risk, because we went ahead and sent it to donors to sort of donate to each of these 2 different stories. And one of the things we realized is that when they were sent to Kibera, which is an informal settlement here in Nairobi, the charity-led, they had better photos, they had, good captions, all those kinds of things. But the contributor, Patrick, who is a community health worker, for him, he just focused on things that he thought were important to the people. In fact, one of the images which we thought was really interesting, he took a photo of this man who had a UNICEF T-shirt, and we're AMREF, so we would obviously not be doing some of those things. But for him, those are authentic stories. It was during COVID, but he chose to tell stories of older people, and this was sent out to donors. And the stats that came out of it are quite interesting, because people saw more authenticity in what Patrick was saying, and they donated more to that kind of stories. So all to say that at this point where we are, is people are looking for more authentic stories. And I think we should also sort of trust our donors, because most of them can also see, they're seeing the injustice in the world, and they want to contribute to some of this. So we've been in that journey to try and develop sort of an ethical handbook within our organization. It's a journey, starting it small and sort of expanding to ensure that it goes not just from communications, but to programs people to understand and see why this is really important. I think the very most important thing is just realizing the power that we have as communicators. and the power that we are, that the stories that we're telling has. It's about sometimes taking that power. Are we ready to give it up or share, relegate in that way? People want to have a seat on the table, and I think we have that opportunity as storytellers to be able to do that. So that's really it from me now.
Thank you. It's very inspiring to hear kind of how this journey went for Amref. And I just want to bring us all back to kind of the frame of today. So I think ethical storytelling and the practices that you describe, and that you have kind of also like now a starting empirical basis to work with. Still, the question that many organizations have is kind of there is a growing sensitivity on the issue. So I would say a lot of organizations are dealing with kind of ethical storytelling, trying to decolonize their visual language, their language in general. And so a lot of efforts are made, and at the same time, a lot of organizations struggle to put all of this in practice for different reasons. Probably some are held back by just arguments of let's do what we know best, what has worked in the past, then maybe just logistical hurdles on the way, probably or just these more community-based communication and fundraising projects are maybe also take more effort and time. So my question to all of you is, how do you perceive that? Like how can we put all these thoughts around ethical storytelling in practice, really? And maybe you also have like practical suggestions for everyone in the audience of Wesley, you said it's step by step, and maybe you have some hints on how to do the first important steps in that direction. Who wants to
No,
pick up?
I'm gonna jump in if that's okay, because I think Wesley had it on point. It does begin with language. Words matter, and they have the power to dispossess and to malign people. But words can also repair broken dignity. And that piece of it, that language piece, is super important. In FHI 360, we also created a language guide and have been working towards that. But there's also sort of systems and processes behind that. And for me, the ethical storytelling begins with fully informed consent of the people that are sharing their story. And as communicators, recognizing when we ask someone to tell their story and they say yes, they are giving us it is a privilege to hear their story. But oftentimes, we as an organization, we are connecting people to support that they need. It might be food for their children on a particular day, or it might be access to education. We as the NGO, we're in the position of power. So we need to make clear to them that there's no quid pro quo. We're asking them out of their generosity, their willingness to share their story. We want to be very clear about what they're consenting to. We're going to be using your photo, your story, your words, your voice in social media, on the internet. This is what this means. You want to try as best you can to co-create the story, work with them, understand how they want to tell their story. And as Catherine so eloquently put as well, using their words and not our words to tell their story. But I think that fully informed consent, with the ability for people to change their mind and to say, you know what, I was with you on this, and now I'm not so much anymore. Now I'm afraid, I'm uncomfortable, and doing what you can to honor and respect that. That is central.
Thanks,
Any
Kirsty.
react? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going
Go
to agree
ahead,
with
Wes.
Winston. I think it's important that they have that informed consent. And from my practical experiences, you've got to take the communities on that journey. So having sort of like a feedback loop. One of our principles in storytelling is collaboration. So making sure that they also feed into it, because that way, you also, at least for me, I think the end product is as good as the process. So if you put a good thought into the process, then it's good. One of the things that we have done, and it's Noah, you mentioned this, sometimes it takes longer. It's an extra step to go to, but it's worth it, is ensuring that once you have something, the communities get to see it before it goes out. So you send it back. Sometimes it goes through the programs people, it goes through, it might take a few, 3 more, 4 days. It's important that that happens. So it closes the feedback loop before you publish something. Second thing is, and this is just for keepsake, is we go out, we take images, we go away, and that's it. One of the things we have done is we try our best, print those photos, send them to those communities. It's very, I think, for keepsake, it goes a long way for them, because that way they're able to, it's not, it doesn't feel, even though in some sense we've been seen as extractive, but just ensuring that they are part of that process, at least from my perspective, is quite important. And then lastly, to your point, is when you look at each step from pre-production to production to dissemination, each of these stages, we need to build in and strengthen it. The programs for who are with the communities every day, because sometimes communications people would just go there to get the content and go away. Those are the ambassadors of the organization, just also building their capacity to ensure that the consent begins even before communications people go there is very important. That way they know, they're aware. And also the last thing is being accountable. Can we, and we try this, and it's not, sometimes, it cannot be easy, but just ensuring that there is a way for communities to say, no, it is okay, and just letting them be aware that it is okay to say no. You don't have to do this at all. In your words, Christine, it's a privilege that they're telling us these stories. So yes, just ensuring that we have accountability mechanisms for us to be accountable for what we do. And when we go wrong, we just admit and say, we didn't do very well in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wes. At this point, I just want to remind you that if you should you have any questions to be discussed, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And before we open up to a broader discussion, again, also answering you or discussing all of your questions, I think it's a good moment to bring in Tendai Marima, a photojournalist, photographer, journalist, and I would say very experienced ethical visual storyteller, also working for Fair Picture in different functions. So you are a professional who's experiencing also all these global changes, all these global financing cuts, and so on in your daily practice also. So given your experience and all the input that you have heard now, what role does ethical storytelling play in the context of decreasing funding? What can you share with us from your very also practical perspective, Tendai?
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Noah, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to all the speakers for sharing some of your experiences as well. It's been interesting to hear what you've had to say. I think I would say, from my perspective, as a journalist and also as a photographer, I think the question of ethical storytelling becomes even more important right now in the face of these cuts, because I think Zimbabwe is a perfect example of how it's not just about the cuts, but it's also a pre-existing situation. How that, combined with the crisis that is going on right now, can actually, in a way, put people whose lives were already difficult, and whose voices were already on the margins of discourse. Those people are further marginalized because of the fact that, for example, some programs have been suspended, and some programs, are kind of in flux. In terms of the media landscape, again, a lot of training programs have been, some of them are ongoing, but there are some that have been stopped. And for example, there's a local radio station, which is, it's Voice of America, but locally here it's known as Studio 7. And Studio 7 is basically a community. It's a local radio station that broadcasts the news in all the local languages. And when these cuts were effected, it meant that the local reporters who work for Studio 7 were no longer employed, right? So the news is now created and produced in Washington, right? There are still Zimbabwean reporters who speak the local languages, but they now the fact that all of this is now being done in Washington and not by reporters who are actually on the ground, kind of in terms of I guess the dynamics of how news should work. The question is, how do you tell a story if you're not on the ground, and whose story are you really telling, and the fact that Studio 7 had this relationship, a very good relationship. Quite a number of the reporters had very, very good relationships with local communities, right? So if their voices are not on air, right, and if their presence is not in those communities, then comes in the question of trust. The question of trust in the media, especially trust between communities and the media, especially in a country like Zimbabwe, it's a very difficult and it's a very fractured relationship. Zimbabwe is not the kind of country where you can just sort of, walk around with some level of freedom and, just go around taking people's pictures. Yeah, there are situations where people in the communities will say, why are you taking my picture? What does this, and then it's very easy for the argument to then escalate into it becoming a politicized kind of thing. So because of the nature of the society, maintaining those relations and those bonds of trust is extremely important. So in the face of the cuts and issues around where the future lies, I think I think for me as a journalist, I find myself going back to certain questions that I always ask myself, to say, whose story is it and who gets to tell it? So from the example that Wesley gave, he gave an example of how they empowered communities to be able to tell their own stories, right? And I think what I've seen in Zimbabwe, in the different places that I've been around, particularly this year, I've seen people asking me, saying, what can you do for us? Who will hear us if we talk to you? And sometimes, like I might be out in the field doing personal projects, right? And it might be that I'm not even thinking beyond myself, in a very kind of selfish way, in the sense that I'm thinking that I would like to get this work done because I'm particularly interested in the story. But then when someone else comes and asks, what can you do for me? Or what can what I tell you help? Like how will it help for you to be able to get my story out there, or for me to be heard? And people are, in some cases, people are very happy to say, thank you for coming to my area, and thank you because people didn't know, or people haven't come here in the last 2 years, so they're unaware of the kind of environmental challenges that we've been facing. For example, like in a community that I went, where there was contaminated water. So because the people have been living like this, they've sort of felt like, they're sort of in a vacuum where they cannot be heard. So the role of the storyteller now, I think it's more important now, and particularly for independent storytellers. It becomes more important to say, how do I collaborate with communities to tell their stories? And how do I tell their stories in such a way that their voices are heard over my own, my own, my own ego, in a sense, or me being driven by, I'd like to do this, and then I tick the box and I move on to the next project. I think now more than ever, it's very important to actually pause and take a moment and say, how do I tell these stories? Or even to retrace one's footsteps, because last year, there were quite a number of campaigns, especially in organizations that are particularly focused on sexual health and reproductive rights. They were very concerned about Trump's campaign at the time and his bid for the presidency, because they knew that it would mean that their organizations would suffer cuts, you know. So in retracing my own footsteps, the challenge for me is going back to those communities and finding out what's happened to some of these people, what's happened to some of these outreach programs that serve in very, very remote areas, you know, to ask myself, like, how are these people able to cope, you know? And if I am able to speak about them because I have the pictures before and I now have a sense that there is something that's happened in the aftermath of the cuts. So what do the before and after tell us, you know? And in talking about these things, am I talking about these things in a responsible way? Am I talking about these things in an actionable way? In the sense that am I helping to raise awareness to the situation that is being faced by these communities that live in very, very remote areas that wouldn't otherwise be of concern on a normal day, you know? And, you know, whose voice is at the forefront of this? Because for sure, I'm not the hero in this. I'm not the savior in this. I'm simply the person who is transmitting the stories of these communities. So I think, again, it's a time where one, as a storyteller, you have to be very aware of your position and be very aware also of the power dynamics. I think earlier on, I'm sorry, I can't remember. I think it was either Christine when she spoke earlier about this rush, you know, to sort of, I think it was Christine or John in the earlier segment of this, where they spoke about this rush to sort of get, you know, work out there, you know, to get content and to get stories and, you know, feed them to the campaign because one is looking for numbers and one wants to make an impact. But in doing all that, one can be careless, you know, and ethics go out the window because there's this rush to sort of, you know, fulfill an expectation, you know, and fulfill a commitment, you know, and to tick the box and say we did it and this is the impact, and so we can measure it and say, hey, we got 10,000 views, so great job, everyone, you know. But I don't think that's the point of ethical fundraising, you know. So I think at this point that we are at in terms of world politics, it's definitely a time to just remember the lessons of ethical storytelling and become more sensitized to the things that guide us. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Tendai, for raising all of these important questions and making the important remark also to pause and take a step back and reflect on what we are actually doing. And I think it's for me now it's very interesting that kind of to realize that it's not only a trust issue, obviously, with the donors and the public that we communicate to, but then also a huge trust issue with the communities that we are working with. Obviously, the reason why we do is done, and also thanks for highlighting the struggles that due to all these funding cuts, kind of the power structures that are shifting, that we have to be careful about when it comes to local, also local skills, kind of the funding for local media, for example, for all of for many different things that are at stake at the moment. Does anyone of you have a reaction to what Tendai just shared with us? If not, I will. Or yeah,
I'm
I
going to
hear.
jump in. I'm going to jump. You can count on me always to jump in, just to say, Tenda, I really loved all your framing, and I think for me a big takeaway for us to remember is that we are the transmitter of the story, right? And I think that is sometimes something that we forget, especially for those of us who are not journalists but who are communicators for an organization. We have a business purpose, which is to drive revenue and policy and advocacy, right? So I think to remember that we are the transmitter, and how do we bring it all together. And so that to me was really resonant, to remember our place in this ecosystem. So thank you for that.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you. And I'm going to just quickly add, sorry, John, want to go?
I was just going to share the hearing of trust and stories and the mindfulness that like we're often find ourselves in a climate where many of the voices are talking about communities in an objectifying and theoretical way. So like as nonprofits, when we're able to humanize and share these stories, I think that's critically important, both Christine, as you mentioned, for the business purpose of supporting this work, but also for the purpose of just simply sharing these stories and humanizing the work that we're doing. You know, numbers show impact, but it's stories that create meaning, and it's stories that create that bond between other communities and our donors. And just a couple simple things I think about. I once heard somebody say, we don't trust this person because they speak about us without speaking to us. So in what ways are we speaking to the people that whose stories are becoming entrusted to us? Like for me, it's being mindful that it's not our story. It's a story that's been entrusted to us. And Wesley, I love your point about sending pictures back, right? If we can't send a picture back to somebody or send them a story that we wrote, you know, how we captured their story in a way that would like show dignity and hope and something that they could be proud of, it's probably a story that we shouldn't be sharing, even if it might help us generate revenue. So, you know, how do we use stories to build trust within the communities that we're inviting generosity from, which is part of a community that we're serving because we're helping them connect with the world, but also how do we do that in a way that builds trust kind of in both directions. So I think those, to me, that's kind of the overwhelming pieces. Yeah, the importance of that ethical storytelling as a way to build trust and inform others about the importance of this work.
I'd like to, at this point, I think there is an interesting question in the chat that plays into what you just said, John, and it goes as a kind of, we agree on the importance and the power of, for example, showing the people depicted or the people communicated about and with the outlets of the communication. But how does that work in practice? What are your mechanisms, or if you do that already? How do you do that, and what would be your, I think it's also a question regarding kind of maybe institutional hurdles. How do you convince other people in your team that sharing or doing these things is potentially important to communication and fundraising and building that trust on many levels?
Can I
Maybe,
jump in?
yeah, of course.
Hi. I love what Wesley has done actually, because there he has got an A/B test which has shown that actually the ethical, authentic storytelling route worked. I do feel that we do have a job, particularly those of us on the call who are in the communications team. A lot of us are really passionate about authentic storytelling. I think we have a piece of work to do internally, which is to really engage fundraising colleagues on the journey to understand that actually this won't affect income, and that not only is it the right thing to do, but actually it can also deepen that engagement with potential supporters or existing supporters. It brings supporters on a journey with us to make that kind of deeper level of connection, and you can see that really well in the example that Wesley shared. That you know, donors found it, they really understood that this was an authentic story. So just from a kind of internal perspective, I think we need to kind of work hard to do that. At Christian Aid, we and a number of organisations, we're members of Pledge for Change, which some of you may know about, but this is a kind of international initiative where we've made three commitments. One is around equitable partnerships, one is around influence, and then the third one is around authentic storytelling. So in that pledge, it's all the things that we're talking about on the call today. So around, you know, consent, really making sure that process of storytelling, of story gathering, is done in a really honouring and ethical way, but then making sure that the framing of those stories, when we then go on to share them through our communication channels, whether that's in direct marketing or in our magazines or on our websites or social media, that we're using those stories in a way that honours the people who shared the story with us. It's been, from my perspective, it's been a really interesting experience. I'd encourage you, if you don't know about Pledge for Change, please do Google it and have a look. One of the things that we have committed to do is we report, we've had one reporting cycle, and as part of that, there was a panel who reviewed a selection of communications. So this was they call it a Southern-led panel of storytellers, journalists from countries outside of the kind of fundraising markets. So having that kind of external lens was really interesting, and I think we've kind of certainly taking away some interesting lessons from that process.
I think you, thank you, Catherine. I think you just gave a part of another, an answer to a part of a question that is also in the chat, and it goes in that direction. It's by Dennis is asking kind of how is ethical storytelling possible when the systems we work in, including donor relations and reporting structures and so on, are still shaped by colonial power dynamics? Now you just mentioned Pledge for Change and kind of the expert group that starts giving inputs through communication reviews, as I understand, so giving external inputs. Do you also see other ways of how to, like how to get that change started within organizations that obviously, like all of us, we are all biased and everyone has to work. So how to get that ball rolling? Any other ideas beyond what you just said, Catherine?
Sorry, struggling to come off mute there. I think a step for us at Christian Aid and in organisations I've worked at previously is to really think about our tone of voice and language guidelines. So to really take that kind of decolonial anti-racism lens to how we talk about our work, our partners, the impact we have, the relationship with our supporters and the supporters' relationship with us and our work. So we have done quite a lot of work on that to really think, bit of soul searching to really think about the language that we use, to make sure that we're framing things in a way that is honest and authentic. Yeah, so that's been really has been quite a journey for us, and I think I'm sure other organizations have had a similar experience, but certainly, what we do recognize, words matter. And so therefore, let's start with thinking about how we frame our work.
Thank you.
One of the big things for me about framing the work is that it's really about connecting people to resources, right? We're connecting people to the resources they need so they can shape their own futures, so they can make the right decisions for themselves and their families. And that is really our place, right? So it's not so much a handout. And I think that's one of the common misconceptions, particularly in the United States. But I've worked in the nonprofit sector, both for US organizations focused on domestic issues and international organizations. Always, it's about connecting people to resources. They are doing the hard work. Not us, relatively speaking, right? So that's the piece of it. But it's a hard sell from the fundraising perspective. People forget fundraising is sales. It's very hard to sell a mission as opposed to selling a pair of really nice fitting blue jeans. So that is one of the big challenges as communicators, is to really show people the value and how we're building a better world for all people. And when all people are uplifted, we all are safer, stronger, more prosperous, to riff off of the mantra of the America First agenda.
Thanks. I'm going to just add just one thing, and how do we just make sure, especially internally, is also to be in tandem with the leadership for them to understand the importance of this, because it's an extra cost to be able to go that extra mile. So them having an understanding why it's important for them to put an investment. In our situation, we have committed now that for every story that we think is a great story, we will go back to meet those communities or that contributor a year later or 2 years later. When you build in an extra day for pre-visit, where you just want to be with these communities, it's an extra cost. But it's just having the leadership to understand why it's important. It's not just going and coming out. It's more than that. It's building that trust. And also, I think the donors will see through they will see the authenticity when that product finally comes out. So this is the point I wanted to bring out. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Time is running very fast. Is there anything that that you want to add at this point? From the panel, I think we answered almost all questions except one that asks you does any one of you support the impact-oriented festival documentary production? I think we answered the rest, but this one is open and I don't get it. So I think that's all. Yeah, so thank you very much, all of you, for this very engaged discussion. And I think yeah, it makes me very hopeful and inspired. And even though we started with a quite with the heavy topic of the funding crisis, also accelerated by the current debates in the UN, and a lot of things are going on at the same time, and it feels like a lot of things are kind of starting to crack a little bit. But from our discussion, my feeling is that a lot of new things are starting to grow, and we see possibilities how to better tell stories, stories that build trust on community levels, but also with our donors. So trust in all the systems. And I'm very I think it's also important for us to have this space today, and I think this will be important in the coming time to share, to learn from each other. I'm also super curious to see where your organizations go, and I think it might be important for all of us to also share our successes with each other. I think it's very inspiring to hear what you all say on these issues, and I'm very excited about the future. Yes. So I'd like to end here, and I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you, Tendai, Christine, John, Wesley, and Catherine. Thank you, Simon and Daniela, for organizing this. Thank you, Moritz, for the introduction words. And there is only one thing left, which is a reminder that we will have another panel discussion on the 30th of September, and we will soon send out an invitation to this chat. And I think that we will continue some of the discussions that we had today. So thank you, everyone, and see you soon, hopefully. Have a beautiful day.